yeah, that yeah, it can be helpful to have something to see as you're also listening. And as David mentioned, we'll also do a practical component today, so you can feel some of this, experience it. All right. Could you make me the host now so I can share? Great, thank you very much. All right. Oh, now I have to just do one little thing here. For some reason, I have 3 things up. I need to make sure I only have 1. All right. Are you able to see that, David?
Yeah, now, yes. Yeah.
Super. All right. So yes, as David mentioned, I'm a level 1 and 2 teacher of CI training, but I'm also the level 1 teacher trainer now, which is exciting, and working on my PhD in kinesiology at the University of Calgary. And so my mentor that you can see here and that David mentioned is Dr. Donna Krasnow, and she's a very highly regarded dance educator, dance scientist, and an author, and notably for our purposes today, the creator of the CI training system. I was fortunate to get to work with Dr. Krasnow during my master's degree at York University, and she's a professor emerita there. And I've continued to work closely with her as a colleague ever since. And so she developed this dance-specific conditioning system that merges the physical work of conditioning with the neuromuscular patterning work or intention of somatic practices through the use of imagery. And so as David noted, that's where we get the CI from, the conditioning and the imagery. And you might think of the conditioning component as like the structural level or tissue level work, where we're talking about strength, flexibility, endurance, these types of things. Whereas the imagery component is operating at a functional level. So organizing and coordinating those tissues that we were talking about in the conditioning work toward ends of alignment and movement patterning. The work is leveled on 3 levels. So there's a beginner and an intermediate and advanced work. And some people who've been practicing for a long time go into what we might call beyond the advanced work. According to Dr. Krasnow, the main purposes of CI training were, of course, first of all, to make a dance-specific system, and there's reasons for that I'll get into in a moment, but to develop and improve or balance our muscle function, and that kind of happens at 3 levels. So we're talking about the strength and the flexibility, or the endurance and flexibility of a given muscle. We're talking about the balanced use of antagonist or opposite muscles or muscle groups, it could be, and then also the motor recruitment of those muscles that we're engaging. So, you know, how much tension, how much release of tension are we using? And second purpose being to address the neuromuscular patterning and repatterning, which not only contributes to injury prevention, but enhancing our technique. And that's where the imagery starts to come in. We're talking about how we execute movement, how we develop dynamic range, how we encourage quality in movement and artistic expression. So that's where that imagery piece and some of the patterning becomes important in something that has an artistic element and a qualitative element, rather than just purely quantitative, like how many baskets or how far did that arrow go, you know, toward the target, where did it land? The third purpose is to assist in transfer of training. And I think this is a really important piece of this work, and one that's not in my experience, addressed as much in some other conditioning systems. So we often engage in conditioning or even somatic practices with the hope that what we're doing, the work that we're doing, will transfer into our dancing, but this isn't always the case. If we look at the research in motor learning or movement learning, what we see is that unless the practice skill and context are really close to the target skill and context or environment, then there's very little transfer. So just because somebody does a bunch of crunches on the floor, yes, they'll have stronger abdominals, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to engage those abdominals, have good balance, have good core support when they're upright and doing complex dance movements. So this is something that's known as the problem of transfer of training. So if we want our conditioning and our somatic work, and in this case, conditioning with imagery work, to transfer into our dancing, then we have to make it as dance-like as possible. So that doesn't mean some of those other things that we might do, like riding a bike to get strong, taking a yoga class to relax, aren't important. Those are important things, but in order to facilitate that transfer of the work directly into our classes, there's a few things that help and that are built into the system. We want to use imagery or visualization that works both in the practice and in the target skill and context. And I want to lay these out because if you're working in a form that's not what this one was originally intended for, we can use these ideas to make it more useful to us in our dance genre. We want to use language and terms that are part of your genre and the musical phrasing that you're likely to be using, as well as, dance-like timing of movement, range of motion that's generally larger than what we have in our daily life, as well as movement complexity. So if we think of the kind of work that we might do with a physiotherapist in rehab or in some conditioning activities that are very simple movements, that's often not what we're doing. In dance, it's very complex. And so we want our conditioning to replicate that, that complexity as well as the greater range of motion. Well, oh, now my thing isn't moving because, did that move it for you? Are you seeing CI training principles now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, something popped up on my screen and suddenly I was elsewhere. So CI training has 5 principles. I'll just look at these very quickly. The idea of integration. So even if we only have one thing that seems to be moving, we're trying to integrate a sense of the whole into what we're doing. So I'm aware of the other parts, even if they're not moving, as well as this notion of body-mind integration. So it's not just a physical activity, my mind is involved in what I'm doing. And if we come at this from the somatic perspective, your mind is really throughout your body. So it's attention to all of me. An increasing principle, and that's within a single session, but also over time and multiple sessions. There's an increase in intensity. So we're going to see more. Either harder or more of something. We're going to see an increasing range of motion, and we're going to see that complexity, as I just mentioned, go from kind of rather simple movements into fairly complex movements in terms of how much of the body is involved in the, the dimensions and space that we're using. Third, we have the alternating principle, which means we're going to do both the right and left sides. So in some dance forms, things aren't balanced, but we're striving for that in CI training. We're going to use the upper and the lower part of the body. We're going to use those antagonist muscle groups, like I said, and that you can think of that simply as the front and back often. The front of the body, we're going to also do the back of the body, the opposite muscles. And there's also a work to rest alternating idea. So as I'm resting my lower body, I might be working the upper body. Specificity really just refers to what I was saying about transfer of training. We want that to be quite specific to what we're doing if we want it to transfer. And then finally, attentiveness, and attentiveness being, attentive to your breath, to your surroundings, your sensations, how your breath coordinates with the movement, but also being present in the moment and present in each movement that you're doing. So there's some mental training that's happening through all of this as well. The system has 7 parts, and the ones that are lighter here, I kind of put there because those things come in as you get more advanced in the system. But as we go through a session, we are doing the fundamentals first, and this is where we're introduced to the underlying principles of the work. And this fundamentals section also serves as the warm-up. But I do want to note that if we look at a proper physiological warm-up, we don't have a circulatory warm-up in this system. So if you're practicing CI training, you may want to do a little bit of a walk, swinging out the legs, using some of the big muscles to raise the body temperature prior to starting this work. And in the fundamentals section, we're introducing the notion of neutral pelvis, which we're going to try today. There are some preparations for the feet and the ankles and the arms. We engage the core, we mobilize the upper torso, and we also introduce the notion of turnout here. Second section is dealing with leg work and core, so establishing the alignment of the legs, as well as stretching, strengthening, and releasing the muscles around the hips. At higher levels, we'll have a little flexibility section here prior to this developing and rounding of the legs section, where it's work that's suitable for genres of dance where we have the legs going up in the air, and wide-ranging motions that you might not necessarily see people doing as they walk down the street. And then the fifth section is about turnout, so working on turnout and endurance of the muscles around the hip. And then we flip over onto our stomachs, or prone, as this dancer is here, and work on extending the spine. So coming up into that back space, but against the pull of gravity, and then working on the muscles of the back of the body. So that's both the upper and lower parts of the body, but all of those muscles along the back. And then a final strength and flexibility section. The strengthening very quickly becomes endurance work. And as David noted, the 1 repetition max. So for some people, 1 or 2 push-ups is all they can manage. So they would indeed be working on some strengthening initially, and then very quickly as they develop sufficient strength into endurance work as they build up the number of repetitions of some upper body work that they can do. We'd have some balancing components and some stretches to work on flexibility. And if we're not going into another class, for instance, then we might also work on some relaxation at this point. I do want to note roots and shoots here. So the system has a Eurocentric base, or has Eurocentric roots, and was originally developed for ballet and modern dancers. And specifically, it was developed for dancers as young as 8 years old, all the way up to professional dancers. There was no assumption of disability. So some of the movements and the terminology are from these forms, and they assume a certain level of ability or a certain type of ability in the body. So that's important to note off the get-go. However, those of us who've been practicing the system for quite some time, like David and I have certainly realized that the form is fairly adaptable, and it can and is being used to prepare dancers for other genres of dance. As well as for people who are new to dance or who don't even specifically practice dance training. They just want to engage with another form of physical activity. And so we see those people as well as older people and people with disabilities. And actually, in fact, this latter note here is important because there is a natural fit due to the initial design of the system, in which it was meant to be useful to dancers who were injured. And so, as David noticed, a lot of it happens on the floor. So you could well have, sprained ankle and be doing much of the work because you're completely supported by the floor. But within that, we find that a variety of abilities can do this work, and it can actually also be done from a chair. Many of the things that we do in the system. So injured dancers, older dancers, dancers with disabilities, and I've also done this work with pregnant dancers. It takes a little bit of equipment to allow someone who's pregnant to have enough support around them to lie face down, but it's all possible. But I do want to note that for this reason, I don't use some of the terms and exercises that are part of the system unless I'm working with, for instance, ballet or modern dancers that use terms like développé and rond de jambe. And so, if I have dancers from other genres and that doesn't really make a lot of sense, I would choose different terms if I'm still going to do some of these big leg movements with them. I would also choose different imagery. the terms that are familiar to people, and that might just be lay terms if they're new to dance. So bend the legs instead of the notion of plie, which has a, again, that Eurocentric base. So choosing imagery, choosing phrasing, choosing movement timing and ranges and specific movements, as David mentioned, where maybe the arm movements are going to look quite different because the arm movements that are part of your dance genre are unlike the ones in CI training. But while the system has quite a solid base, there is a lot of room in there to invent one's own movements, one's own imagery, and to use different language. I do want to note that one thing I do incorporate, regardless of whether people practice a dance genre that has turnout specifically built into it or not, so that rotation at the hips, I do include a lot of the turnout work or external rotation work because it does contribute to hip stability, which is useful. And also if we think of changing direction, so if I'm facing this way and I go and turn, and start to head off in this direction. If I actually have some coordination around the hip to allow myself to turn out that standing leg and step, it can protect the standing ankle and knee. So I do the turnout work with almost everybody that I work with, all populations. David did mention that I should talk a little bit about teacher training. So there is teacher training for CI. We have 2 levels of teacher training, and the level 1 that I give courses for is in the beginner and intermediate level CI training work, and it's a 6-day course. 6 hours per day, so 36 hours total. And there's a certifying practical exam on the final day. For Canadians, it's 800 Canadian for that, which is pretty reasonable compared to a lot of systems out there that do certification. And this one's done in person because there's a lot of hands-on work that we expect the instructors to know. That tactile feedback when we're helping students help each other is quite important. And so that one is done in person. And we do have one coming up the last week of August in Calgary, so you could contact me about that. And then our level 2 certification, we've done a few times now online. And so Donna does this one. It's the advanced level work, and it's a 3-day course. So half the time, half the price, and that same practical exam. We're expecting to do one of these in the fall. So today I thought it would be fun for us to try a little something from most sections. So from the fundamentals, we'll have a look at neutral pelvis and the bowl of the body, which is the preparation for a lot of the abdominal or core work that we do. And then from the second part of the work, we're going to try rotating in and out. And then we'll skip over those next 2 sections, try baby and full clam, one of my favorites. By the time you've done both sets, you can really feel where those stabilizers of the hips are. But again, they're also the prime movers for our turnout. And then we have extension, so that going up into the back space, we'll do something for the lower end, something for the upper body, and finish off with a couple little stretches and some of the balancing work that I love from CI training. So I just wanted to quickly show you a couple of photographs here on why the work on the floor is really useful. So if you look at the standing body, we know that there's less stress or wear and tear on the tissues of the body, at the joints, around the joints, if we can align our bodies in such a way that the big body weights are stacked and that the plumb line or the pull of gravity is coming through our joint centers. When we lie on the floor, you can see, so I've just actually tipped one of those pictures. The floor and gravity just align us in this kind of neutral alignment, if you will, in an easeful way. So we don't have to do anything, but we get to start having an experience of what that is. And we also get the tactile feedback of the floor. So we can feel the heels, we can feel the sacrum or back of your pelvis, back of your rib cage, back of the head on the floor. But then we'll notice that there's a little space at the low back there, a lumbar space, and behind the neck, a cervical space. And that those curves, if you will, of the spine are meant to be there when we're standing upright. So the other thing that lying on the floor does is it gives us a chance to either work with or against gravity, to say, make something harder or easier. And we do both of those things in CI training. Here's a little look at neutral pelvis. And certainly we do not expect that in dance that we're staying perpetually in neutral pelvis, but having an understanding of where neutral pelvis is really helpful, because we get a lot of the balance and that neutral up and